Flames devoured the ranch, painting the night sky in shades of hell. Smoke clawed at Lila Hart's eyes as she gripped the cold steel of a revolver, her heart hammering against her ribs. From the darkness beyond the yard, hooves thundered like war drums. "Send the girl out," roared Rufus Kane, his voice rolling through the firelit night. "Or burn with her." For a breathless moment, time froze. Step outside and her life was over. Stay hidden, and she would have to fight. Fear wrapped around her like chains, but deep inside, a spark of defiance burned. The world held its breath, until a single gunshot split the night, and everything changed. This was the moment when a terrified girl became a fighter, and the flames would decide who lived and who died. The sun in Dust Haven was merciless that day, glaring down on the red dirt street and baking the timber storefronts until the air shimmered with heat. A lone vulture circled overhead as if it, too, could smell the desperation below. 17-year-old Lila Hart stumbled behind her father, Elias, her bare feet coated in dust. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, the fibers biting into her skin. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the ground, her long brown hair hiding her face from the townsfolk who had started to gather. Elias's voice cracked as he dragged her up the steps of a makeshift wooden platform in the center of the street. He'd been here before, trying to sell pigs and mules, but never like this. "Gentlemen," he called out, his tone trembling with a mixture of shame and bravado. "This here's my daughter, Lila Hart, strong, healthy, untouched. I—" His voice faltered, then steadied with a deep swallow. "I'm offering her to settle my debt with Mr. Rufus Kane." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Men leaned against porch posts and barrels, some grinning, some grimacing. Mothers who had wandered into town with their children turned away, pulling their little ones along. Lila kept her head down, but she could feel the eyes crawling over her, measuring her as if she were livestock, as if she weren't a person at all. "Starting bid, $50, Elias shouted, voice breaking. "50, a prospector barked, grinning through a gap-toothed smile. "75, called another, a saloon owner with a greasy vest and a leer that made Lila's stomach twist. From his black horse at the edge of the platform, Rufus Kane watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. The long scar across his jaw caught the sun as he tipped a silver coin in his fingers. He was in no rush. He'd humiliated men like Elias Hart before, and he'd enjoy buying the girl cheap, then turning her misery into a profit in Denver. The bidding climbed to $120, each call hammering another nail into the coffin of Lila's innocence. Her chest burned with humiliation. She thought about running, her legs twitching with the instinct to flee. But Kane's men were everywhere, hands resting on their pistols, ready to strike. Then, just as the heat and the stares became unbearable, the crowd grew quiet. A tall man in a weathered black coat appeared at the far end of the street. He didn't shout. He didn't move quickly. He simply walked with purpose, each step slow, deliberate, and unshakable. Lila felt the hair rise on her arms. Something about his presence cut through the noise, through the heat, through the humiliation. Nathaniel Graves Cole reached the edge of the platform and looked up, his gray eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, for the first time all day, she felt a fragile spark of hope. He didn't look at her like the other men. There was no hunger there, no mockery, only a kind of quiet resolve. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, heavy with coins. The metallic clink silenced the last whispers of the crowd. $200, Graves said evenly, his voice carrying across the street like a steel blade slicing through the air. The world seemed to hold its breath. $200 wasn't just enough to outbid everyone. It was exactly the amount Elias Hart owed Rufus Kane. Enough to pay the debt, but leave Kane with no profit, no victory, and no satisfaction. Kane's jaw tightened. "That covers the debt," he said slowly. "But what about my time, my trouble, my men who—" Graves took a single step closer. The crowd instinctively parted. The air between the two men thickened like a drawn bowstring. "The debt's 200, Graves said softly, but there was iron in his voice. "I'll not say it again." For a heartbeat, Kane's hand twitched near his holster. But something in the stranger's gaze, a calm, lethal certainty, froze him in place. This was not a man to draw on and live to tell the tale. With a sharp exhale through his nose, Kane spat in the dirt. "Fine, she's yours." Elias nearly collapsed with relief as Graves dropped the silver coins into his trembling hands. The sound of the rope sliding off Lila's wrists was the sweetest sound she had ever heard. She rubbed the raw skin and dared to lift her eyes to the man who had just bought her freedom. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Graves gave a single nod and turned to the crowd. His words were simple, but his tone carried a warning that settled into every spine along that street. "She's under my protection now. Anyone with a problem can settle it with me." No one moved. As the crowd dispersed, Lila glanced back to see her father standing in the dust, clutching the silver like a lifeline. He couldn't meet her eyes. He had his money, he had his shame, and she had nothing but the hand of a stranger in the faintest thread of hope. But in the shadows, Rufus Kane watched, his face hard and silent. His humiliation would not be forgotten. And Lila knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The town of Dusthaven emptied behind them like a bad memory. Nathaniel Graves Cole led the way, his boots silent against the dirt, his long black coat shifting in the dry wind. Behind him, Lila Hart walked with small, hesitant steps, glancing back at the place that had nearly swallowed her whole. The ropes were gone from her wrists, but the marks remained, angry and red. Her arms felt strangely light, as if freedom itself was foreign. She didn't know this man. She didn't know why he had spent $200 to save her. All she knew was that she was safer near him than anywhere else in the world. Graves stopped at the hitching post where a black stallion waited, massive and restless. He ran a hand down the horse's neck, calming it, then turned to her. "Can you ride?" His voice was quiet but carried the weight of command. "I think so," she said, unsure if her trembling legs could even lift her onto the saddle. He swung into the saddle in one smooth motion and extended a calloused hand. "Up you go." Lila hesitated for half a heartbeat, then placed her small hand in his. He pulled her up effortlessly, settling her behind him. She clung to the back of his coat, the smell of leather and dust filling her nose. The warmth of the horse and his steady presence eased the chill in her bones. "Hold on," he said simply. The stallion surged forward, hooves striking the packed earth, carrying them out of Dusthaven and into the open wilderness. The wind whipped through Lila's hair as the world stretched wide around her. Rolling hills of pale grass, scattered cottonwoods, and the endless blue sky that had watched every cruelty this land had to offer. Her heart still thudded from the auction block, from the memory of the men's eyes, from the voice that had threatened to claim her as property. For a long while they rode in silence. The rhythm of the horse and the warmth of the sun lulled her, but fear gnawed at her chest. Finally, she found the courage to speak. Why did you help me?" Graves didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the horizon, where the land met the sky in a thin, endless line. At last he spoke, his tone low and rough. "Because someone should have helped my sister. Nobody did." The words hung heavy in the air. Lila pressed her cheek to the back of his coat, wondering what had happened to the sister he spoke of, and feeling a strange, sharp ache for a man she barely knew. Hours later, the sun began to dip, staining the hills with gold. On the far slope, a small ranch came into view. A weathered wooden house, a barn, and a fenced pasture that had seen better days. Compared to the dust and danger of town, it looked like a sanctuary. "That's Ironwood Ranch," Graves said, reining the stallion to a slower pace. "My place. Not much, but it's honest land." To Lila, it looked like the first safe place she had seen in years. For a fleeting moment, she imagined sitting by a fire, eating warm bread, sleeping without fear. But as they rode into the yard, the hope in her chest froze. The front door hung open, swaying in the wind. Graves stiffened immediately. His hand went to the revolver at his hip. "Stay behind me," he said in a low voice. He dismounted in one fluid motion and scanned the yard, his movements quiet and precise. He guided the horse toward the water trough and motioned for Lila to crouch behind it. "Don't move," he murmured. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she sank low behind the trough. Every creak of wood, every rustle of dry grass became a threat. She watched as Graves moved like a shadow along the side of the house, his revolver drawn, his boots silent in the dirt. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then finally he returned, his expression grim. "They're gone," he said, sliding the gun back into its holster. "But they left a message." He led her inside. Her stomach twisted at the sight, chairs overturned, dishes smashed, drawers yanked from the cabinets and dumped onto the floor. But the worst of it was on the far wall. Painted in red, the words screamed at her, "She belongs to me, Kane." Lila felt her knees weaken. Her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. She had escaped Dusthaven, but she hadn't escaped Rufus Kane. He had followed her here, and now she had brought danger to the man who had saved her. I I should leave," she stammered, voice shaking. "If I go, maybe he'll—" Graves shook his head, his gray eyes cold and steady. "Rufus Kane doesn't forgive. He doesn't forget. Running will only make you easier to catch." She sank to the floor among the wreckage, trembling. Freedom had not brought the lightness she imagined. It was heavier than chains because now she understood the cost. Graves crossed the room, pried up a loose floorboard, and revealed a hidden compartment. Inside lay a rifle, boxes of ammunition, and a leather pouch of coins. He checked the rifle's action with the smoothness of a man who had done it 1,000 times. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "If he comes, we'll be ready." Lila stared at him, her heart pounding. She wasn't just a girl who had been sold anymore. She was a fighter in the making, standing on the edge of a battle she had never asked for, but one she knew she could no longer run from. Night fell heavy over Ironwood Ranch, cloaking the hills in darkness. A cold wind swept through the dry grass, rattling the barn boards and carrying the faint scent of rain that would never come. Inside the battered house, Lila Hart sat on the floor beside the hearth, staring at the blackened words scrawled across the wall. "She belongs to me, Kane." The letters seemed to glow in the dim lantern light, a threat that slithered under her skin. Her hands trembled in her lap. Across the room, Nathaniel Graves Cole moved with the precision of a man who had survived too many nights like this. He loaded rifles, checked revolvers, and laid out ammunition in neat rows along the table. "You ever shoot a gun before?" he asked without looking at her. Lila hesitated, her voice small. My mother taught me when I was 12. Said a girl on the frontier had to know." "Good," Graves said, his tone even. "You'll need it tonight." The way he said it, calm, certain, sent a chill down her spine. Hours passed in tense silence. The only sounds were the groan of the wind and the soft click of Graves's rifle as he worked the action. Lila tried to steady her breathing, but every creak of the house made her jump. Somewhere in her chest, fear coiled tighter than rope. Then came the first distant sound of hoofbeats. Lila's heart lurched. She rose to her knees and peered out the broken window. On the horizon, faint specks moved against the starlit hills. The rhythm of the hooves grew louder, joined by the metallic clink of spurs and the low murmur of men's voices. "They're here," she whispered. Graves was already at the window, gray eyes sharp. "Stay low, and whatever happens, don't freeze." The stallion in the barn whinnied, restless, as the riders approached. The hoofbeats multiplied, echoing in the night until they surrounded the ranch like a drumbeat of war. Then Rufus Kane's voice tore through the darkness, cold and cruel. "Crow," he bellowed, using Graves's old nickname. "I know you're in there with my property. Send the girl out, and maybe I'll let you live." The words sliced through Lila like a knife. Property. He still saw her as nothing more than something to own, to break. Her fingers curled into fists. Graves didn't answer. He crouched by the window, rifle steady, a statue carved from shadow. "I ain't gonna ask twice," Kane roared. "Boys, light it up!" The first gunshot shattered the window glass. A second shot followed, splintering the doorframe. Sparks flared as lantern light caught the bullets. Then came the unmistakable sound of fire, oil-soaked rags sailing through the air, smashing against the outer walls. Flames licked up the dry boards, orange light flickering against Lila's face. Smoke seeped inside, acrid and choking. "They're gonna burn us alive," she gasped, panic clawing at her chest. "Not if we move smart," Graves said. He grabbed her arm, his voice firm but steady. "There's a tunnel. My grandfather dug it during the Indian Wars. Leads to the barn. We go now, or we die here." They dropped to the floor, crawling beneath the rising smoke toward the kitchen. Behind them, the crackle of fire grew louder, the heat pressing against their backs. Lila coughed, dirt scraping her hands and knees as Graves pulled up a rug and wrenched open a trapdoor hidden beneath. "Go," he ordered. She slid into the narrow tunnel, the packed earth cold against her skin. Graves followed, dragging the trapdoor closed above them. The world narrowed to darkness, the only sounds their ragged breaths and the distant roar of fire. The tunnel was barely wide enough to crawl, and the rough beams snagged at Lila's dress. Dirt crumbled into her hair and mouth, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The alternative was unthinkable. At last, a faint draft of cool air brushed her face. Graves pushed upward, and a wooden panel gave way. They emerged into the barn, gasping for breath as the night sky spread above them like salvation. The stallion stamped nervously in its stall, ears flicking at the sounds of men shouting outside. Through the gaps in the barn wall, Lila saw the house engulfed in flame, shadows of Kane's men moving against the orange glow. They were laughing, passing a bottle, certain their prey was trapped. Graves checked his rifle and glanced at her. In the dim light, she saw the steel in his eyes. "This is where we make our stand," he said. She nodded even as fear quaked in her bones. Her hands shook as she checked the small pistol he'd given her. Her mother's lessons came rushing back. Breathe, aim, squeeze. Through the barn wall, a figure moved into view. A rider had dismounted, strolling toward the barn, pistol in hand, overconfident. Graves's rifle cracked, and the man dropped without a sound. Chaos erupted outside. Shouts, gunfire, the pounding of boots. Another man ran toward the barn. Lila's heart leapt to her throat, but this time, she didn't freeze. She raised the pistol, squeezed the trigger, and the recoil jolted her arm. The attacker stumbled, then fell still in the dirt. The barn filled with smoke and gunpowder, burning her lungs and stinging her eyes. Her ears rang, but a fierce spark lit inside her chest. Through the cracks of the barn wall, she saw the yard glowing with firelight, shadows of Kane's men flickering against the flames. Across the yard, Rufus Kane stood with 3 men still alive, his face twisted in rage. Yet behind the fury, Lila saw fear. She gripped her pistol tighter. She was no longer the helpless girl on the auction block. Tonight, she would fight for her life. The smug cruelty he had worn in Dust Haven was gone. This was a man cornered by pride and fury, and even in the firelight, Lila saw something else: fear. "Crow!" Kane's voice cracked as he aimed his revolver toward the barn. "You think you can steal from me? You think you can take what's mine?" Beside her, Nathaniel, Graves Cole, stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand, his silhouette framed against the firelight like a shadow of judgment. His voice was low but carried across the chaos. "She was never yours." The words cut deeper than any bullet. Kane's teeth clenched, and he gestured sharply to his men. "Kill them!" 2 of the outlaws charged across the open yard. Graves moved first. His rifle barked twice, thunder in the night. One man spun and fell face first in the dirt. The other stumbled, clutching his chest before crumpling near the fence. The third man hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. He glanced at Kane, then at the burning house, then turned and bolted into the darkness, spurs jingling as he fled the doomed fight. Lila's breath came in sharp bursts. Her hands shook, but her heart burned hot with the fire of survival. It was down to 3 of them now, her, Graves, and Rufus Kane. Kane stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his boots crunching over the dry dirt. The firelight danced across his scarred jaw, his revolver steady at his side. "You're a dead man, Crow," he said, voice rough. "You and that little whore you stole from me." Lila flinched at the word, rage rising to meet her fear. Graves didn't blink. He took another step forward, placing himself fully in the open yard. "You've got one chance, Kane," he said, his voice like cold steel. "Draw your gun, or leave in the dirt." The air thickened. The fire crackled. A single coyote howled in the distance, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Kane's eyes twitched. His hand hovered over the revolver on his hip. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. just long enough for Lila to see the truth behind the bravado. He was a man who'd built his life on intimidation and cruelty, but face to face with someone unshaken, his courage faltered. Graves didn't move. The silence became unbearable, broken only by the hiss of collapsing timbers behind them. Then Kane snapped. His hand lunged for the revolver. The motion was fast, but not fast enough. Graves's rifle thundered. The bullet struck true. Kane staggered, his revolver slipping from his fingers. He dropped to his knees, staring up at the sky as if it had betrayed him. Blood bloomed dark across his shirt, and for the first time, he looked small. You ruined everything, he rasped before toppling face first into the dirt. The yard fell silent except for the distant crackle of fire. The night had swallowed the last echo of Rufus Kane. For a long moment, Lila couldn't move. Her chest heaved, and tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry slid down her cheeks. Graves approached slowly, his expression unreadable, rifle still in hand. "It's over," he said, his voice quieter now, as if the land had demanded respect for the dead. She swallowed hard and nodded, but deep inside she knew something had changed forever. She was no longer the girl on the auction block. Tonight she was a survivor, forged in fire and blood. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the hills, they buried the bodies at the edge of the property. Graves worked in silence, his hands steady, while Lila gathered what she could from the barn and the blackened ruins of the house. By the time the last grave was filled, the smoke had thinned into a gray haze over Ironwood Ranch. The land smelled of ash and dirt and something new: freedom. When Lila stood beside Graves, her voice was steady for the first time. "Thank you for everything." Graves looked at her, his gray eyes softening just a fraction. "Wasn't just for you," he said. "Some things a man does because he has to." And with that, the long night finally ended, leaving only the quiet promise of a new beginning. Morning crept slowly across the scarred hills of Ironwood Ranch. The night smoke still lingered, curling from the blackened remains of the house like ghostly fingers refusing to let go. The once proud homestead now stood as a skeleton of charred beams and ashes, a quiet witness to the battle that had raged under the stars. Lila Hart stepped barefoot into the dew-soaked grass, the coolness soaking into her skin. She stared at the ruins in silence. It was hard to believe that only yesterday she had been standing on a dusty platform in Dust Haven, certain that her life was over. Now she was alive, free, and standing in the ashes of the fight that had given her that freedom. Behind her, Nathaniel Graves Cole emerged from the barn, his black coat dusted with soot, his gray eyes calm but heavy with fatigue. He carried a spade and a coil of rope, his movements deliberate, as if he'd performed this ritual more than once in his life. "Come on," he said quietly. "We've got work to do." Together they began the slow task of burying the past. They laid Rufus Kane and his fallen men in simple graves at the far edge of the property, beneath a line of stubborn oak trees that had survived the fire. There were no words over the mounds of fresh dirt, only the whisper of wind through the grass. When the last grave was filled, Graves leaned on his spade, gazing at the smoldering remains of the ranch house. "It'll take time to rebuild," he said. His voice wasn't bitter, just steady, like a man who had learned to accept the cost of survival. Lila followed his gaze, her chest tightening. She had no home to go back to. Her father, Elias, had chosen cards and whiskey over blood, and she knew she'd never see him again, not in any way that mattered. Yet standing here among the ashes, she realized something she never had before. Home wasn't always where you were born. Sometimes it was where you chose to stand and fight. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Lila fetched water from the creek, mended fence rails, and learned how to saddle the stallion without trembling hands. Graves worked quietly beside her, showing her how to set traps for rabbits, how to check the sky for weather, and how to aim a rifle without flinching. They rarely spoke of the night of fire and blood, but it lived in every shared glance and quiet moment. Life on the ranch slowly replaced fear with a steady, growing strength. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in golden rose, Lila sat on the porch of the rebuilt barn and watched the land breathe under the fading light. The air was warm, the earth smelled clean, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly safe. She whispered to herself, a promise carried on the breeze. I'll never be powerless again. And beside her, silent as ever, Graves nodded once, because he understood. A new dawn had come to Ironwood Ranch, forged in fire, blood, and the unbreakable will to survive. Life on the frontier was harsh, but the choices people faced back then are not so different from the ones we face today. Lila Hart's story reminds us that courage is rarely loud. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to stand your ground, to rebuild your life, and to protect the people who matter most. In modern America, we may not fight gunmen on the prairie or defend our homes with rifles, but we still face the same tests of character. We face betrayal, fear, in moments when it feels easier to give up. And like Lila, the real turning point comes when we decide, will we run from life or will we fight for our future? Stories like this also ask us to reflect on family, trust, and the weight of our choices. Elias Hart's weakness cost him his daughter, a lesson as true now as it was then. When we abandon our responsibilities, the damage can last a lifetime. And yet there is hope. The fire that destroyed Ironwood Ranch also forged a new beginning for Lila, a reminder that from loss, we can rise stronger. But what do you think? If you were in her place, would you have stayed and fought, or would you have run? And do you believe Graves and Lila truly found peace? Or is their story just beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next tale from the frontier. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. And remember, courage can be silent, but it can change your life forever.